Wyoming Territory, 1885. The land was a testament to God's grandest and cruelest impulses. It stretched in every direction under a sky so vast it could make a man feel like an ant or a king or nothing at all. Caleb Thorne had felt like all three at one time or another. Today, as he rode the perimeter of his Whispering Creek ranch, he felt mostly like a part of the landscape itself, weathered, silent, and enduring. The wind, a constant companion, worried the brim of his hat and carried the scent of pine and dry dust. It was a clean scent, vrind of the complications of man, and he breathed it in like a prayer. His world was one of ordered solitude. It was etched in the straight lines of his fences, in the neat stacks of hay in the barn, in the precise way he cleaned his rifle every Sunday evening. This order was his fortress, built stone by painstaking stone after chaos had torn his first life promacheo. He had learned the hardest lesson a man could learn. That love was a vulnerability, and attachment was the gateway to a pain so absolute it could hollow a man out from the inside. He had been hollowed out once. He would not allow it to happen again. Caleb reined in his buckskin, an animal as steady and quiet as he was, and scanned the valley. His land. The creek that gave it its name was a shimmering ribbon of life. The reason this patch of earth was green when any pastures were brown and parched. It was the reason he had to be vigilant. It was the reason men like Silas Croft, whose greed was as vast as the plains themselves, looked upon his property with a covetous eye. But Caleb was not a man so easily moved. He had put down roots in this hard soil, roots watered by grief, and they ran deeper than any man could dig. He thought of them, as he always did in these quiet moments. Sarah, with her laughter that sounded like wind chimes, and little Ben, whose small hand had fit so perfectly in his. The fever had taken them in the space of a week, a silent, merciless thief in the night. It had been 5 years. 5 years of building walls around the empty space they had left. He survived. He endured. That was enough. To ask for more was to tempt fate, to invite the storm back into the calm. A sound came high from the east, thin and mournful, slicing through the afternoon's quietude. The train whistle. It was a sound of another world, a world of cities and crowds and hurried lives he had long since abandoned. It was a disruption, a twice-weekly reminder of a life he had turned his back on. Usually, he paid it no mind, but today, for some reason he could not name, a disquiet settled over him. It felt like a stone dropped into the still pool of his existence, the ripples spreading outward, unseen but felt. He nudged his horse forward, his jaw set. It was nothing. It was only the train. Alara Vance stepped down from the passenger car, her hand gripping the rail formatos to steady herself. The iron was hot beneath her gloved fingers. After days of rhythmic clatter and a world rushing past in a blur of green and brown, the sudden stillness was disorienting. She took a breath, and sigh was her first true taste of the West. It was dust, a fine, gritty powder that coated her tongue and carried the unfamiliar scents of sagebrush and baked earth. It was nothing like the damp, coal-tinged air of Philadelphia she had left behind. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, scanned the small wooden platform. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a practical navy wool that had seemed so sensible back east, but here felt heavy and dark against the sun-bleached landscape. She was looking for a man she had never met, a Mr. Jacob Sterling. His letters, penned in a surprisingly elegant hand, had painted a picture of a prosperous life, of a respectable gentleman farmer seeking a partner to share it with. He had written of open spaces and a future Epsilon Tau Phi Iota Epsilon Alpha from the confines of her life as a companion to a wealthy, cantankerous widow. For Alara, orphaned and alone, his words had been a lifeline. But the platform was nearly empty. A few rough-looking men loaded crates onto a wagon, their gazes lingering on her with a frank curiosity that made her cheeks burn. The station master, a harried man with a kind, tired face, was checking his pocket watch. No one stepped forward protein a welcoming smile. There was no Mr. Jacob Sterling. A small, cold knot of apprehension began to form in her stomach. She approached the station master, her heart comicando a beat a little faster. "Pardon me," she began, her voice sounding unnaturally formal in the open air. "I am looking for a Mr. Jacob Sterling. He was to meet me here." The man pushed his spectacles up his nose and looked at her, then at the single, large trunk sitting forlornly drew the platform. "Sterling, you say?" "Jacob Sterling." He shook his head pro Macao. "Lived here 20 years, ma'am. Know every soul in this county. Never been a Jacob Sterling." The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. That cannot be," Ilara stammered, her gloved fingers clutching her reticule. "He wrote to me. He sent me the ticket. He has a farm, just outside of town." She fumbled inside her bag, her hands shaking, and produced a creased envelope. The address was clear. Mr. Jacob Sterling, Redemption, Wyoming Territory. The station master's kind face filled with pity, a look Ilara was beginning to dread. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but there's no farm under that name. There's no man by that name. Looks to me like someone's played a cruel trick on you." The knot in her stomach tightened into a fist of ice. A trick. The letters, the promises, the carefully saved money for her passage, all of it a lie. The vast, open space that had seemed so full of promise moments before now felt menacing, empty, and hostile. She was 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, with dwindling funds and a single trunk, Epsilon Alpha Iota Rho Epsilon Alpha, her name. The sun beat down, and for a moment, the world vorteeled to tilt. Caleb had finished his business at the general store, loading sacks of flour and salt into the back of his wagon. He was about to climb up to the driver's seat when he saw her. She was impossible to miss, a splash of dark blue merino wool in a sea of brown canvas and faded denim. She stood on the train platform, a solitary figure framed against the immense, indifferent sky. He had noticed her the moment she'd stepped off the train, an obvious transplant from back east. Dunn had paid her no mind. It was not his concern. But hours had passed. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western clouds in hues of fiery orange and soft violet. The platform was now deserted, save for her and her trunk. She stood with a ramrod-straight posture that seemed to be the only thing holding her together. Caleb, who was an expert in the subtle tells of human desperation, recognized it instantly. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way her gaze kept darting around as if searching for an escape that did not exist. He told himself to leave. He told himself it was not his business. He had his own life to manage, his own fortress to maintain. A woman like that, refined and lost, was the sigh of trouble he had sworn to avoid. Trouble had a way of finding the cracks in a man's armor. Yet he hesitated. The memory of Sarah, arriving in a similar town years ago, young and hopeful Condicos his side, flickered Pimpao his mind. It was a ghost he usually kept locked away, but the woman on the platform had somehow picked the lock. With a low curse muttered under his breath, Caleb tied the reins of his wagon to the hitching post and walked across the dusty street. His steps were measured, his face an unreadable mask. He was a fool. He knew he was a fool for getting involved. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "It's getting late. The station's closed." Ilara jumped at the sound of his voice. She turned, her eyes wide and startled. They were a shocking, brilliant blue, rimmed with a shimmer of unshed tears. In her haste, her foot caught on an uneven plank. She gasped, stumbling backward, her balance lost. Instinct, faster than thought, took over. Caleb lunged forward, his hands shooting out to steady her. He caught her by the upper arms, his strong fingers closing over the soft wool of her dress. The momentum of her fall brought her flush against his chest. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. He was acutely aware of the solid, warm weight of her, of the faint, clean scent of lavender that clung to her clothes. It was a scent from another life, a scent of gardens and linen presses and a softness he had long since forgotten. It was a jarring, intimate, and profoundly unwelcome sensation. Ilara's hands had flown up to his chest to brace herself. Her palms, Epsilon Alpha Iota Rho Epsilon Alpha, the hard, unyielding wall of his torso. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. She looked up, her face inches from his. He was tall, broader than she had realized. His face was all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, his eyes a deep, guarded brown. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent severity. He smelled of leather, dust, and clean sweat, the very essence of this raw, new land. The shock of the contact, the sheer, unexpected physicality of it, sent a jolt through her. Caleb released her, as if he had been burned, taking a quick step back. He cleared his throat, sighed his quiet from earlier returning tenfold. "You should be careful," he said, the words amiv out artigos than he intended. Thank you." Elara managed, her voice trembling slightly. She smoothed her dress, her cheeks with the weather from embarrassment or the lingering shock of his touch. She could not say. "I was just waiting for someone who isn't coming," Caleb stated flatly. It was not a question. He had heard Station Master Gaines telling the story to the blacksmith not an hour ago. The whole town knew. A mail-order bride, bilked and abandoned. The bluntness of his statement a slap. The tears she had been fighting to hold back welled in her eyes. "So, it would seem," she whispered, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance that was at odds with the despair in her eyes. "I assure you, I can manage." Caleb's gaze swept over her. She was trying to be brave, but she was as out of place here as a songbird in a hawk's nest. Night was falling. The saloon near it was already spilling yellow light and raucous laughter into the street. Redemption was a decent enough town, but it had its share of predators, and she looked like easy prey. His conscience, that stubborn, inconvenient part of him he could never quite kill, would not let him walk away. "There's one hotel in this town," he said, his tone practical. "It's above the saloon. It's not a place for a lady." He paused, hating the words before they even left his mouth. "I have a ranch, a few miles out. My housekeeper, Martha, is there. You could stay the night. We'll figure something out in the morning." Elara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperation. A stranger, a mountain of a man with hard eyes and a voice like stones grinding together, was offering her shelter. In Philadelphia, she would have dismissed him out of hand. But this was not Philadelphia. Her options were a room above a saloon or the charity of this intimidating man. She looked at his face, searching for any sign of ill intent. She saw none, only a deep, weary reluctance, as if he were extending the invitation against his own better judgment. "Why?" she asked obstaculos, her voice barely audible. "Why would you help me?" Caleb's gaze flickered away, toward the darkening mountains. He did not have a simple answer. He was doing it because of a ghost memory, because of a stubborn code of honor he thought he had buried. "Because my mother raised me better than to leave a woman stranded on a train platform," he said gruffly. It was the simplest truth. He gestured toward his wagon. "Come on, I'll take your trunk." Without waiting for her answer, he turned, hoisted the heavy trunk Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha his shoulder with Membrose ease, and carried it to the wagon. Elara watched him go, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha, her to be cautious. Yet her situation was dire. She took one last look at the empty platform, the symbol of her shattered hopes, and then, with a deep, shaky breath, she followed him. She had no other choice. The ride to the ranch was silent, save for the creaking of the wagon wheels and the chirping of crickets. Elara sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The man beside her, Caleb Thorne, he had introduced himself as, in a clipped, monosyllabic fashion, handled the reins with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He did not speak, his profile a stark silhouette against the twilight. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not threatening either. It was heavy, weighted with Stvari unsaid. As they left the meager lights of redemption behind, the world opened up into an ocean of shadow and silver. The moon, nearly full, the landscape in a ghostly glow, turning the sagebrush into clumps of spectral lace. The air grew cooler, carrying a clean, wild scent. Despite her fear and uncertainty, a part of Elara was struck by the raw, untamed beauty of it all. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also magnificent. They arrived at a ranch house. Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha was dark save for a single warm, yellow light glowing in one window. It was a sturdy, simple structure of timber and stone. Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha looked as if it had grown Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha of the land itself. A large barn and several corrals stood nearby. As Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt, the front door opened and a woman appeared, silhouetted against the lamplight. She was stout, with graying hair pulled into a neat bun. "Caleb, that you?" she called out, her voice warm and no nonsense. The woman, Martha, peered at Alara, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Lord have mercy, Caleb. What have you brought home?" "Trouble, I imagine," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He then spoke louder. "This is Miss Vance. She's been stranded. She'll be staying in the spare room tonight." He began unhitching the team, his movements indicating the conversation was over. Martha, however, was not so easily dismissed. The inside of the house was masculino and scrupulously clean. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, where a low fire crackled merrily. The furniture was simple, handmade, and sturdy. It was a space Epsilon Alpha Iota Epsilon Alpha was clearly a man's mulhers. Yet Martha's touch was evident in the braided rug on the floor and the pot of dried wildflowers on the mantel. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and beeswax. Martha led her to a small, neat room with a single bed covered in a handmade quilt. "You can rest here, dear. There's water in the pitcher. Supper is on the stove if you're hungry." She paused, her hand resting erguid the doorframe. "Caleb is a good man. Gruff, but good. You're safe here." Alara, overwhelmed by the woman's simple kindness, felt her composure finally crumble. The tears she had held back all day streamed down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat. "You are so kind." Martha's expression softened. She stepped forward and patted Alara's shoulder awkwardly. There, child. You let out. Whatever happened, tomorrow is a new day. You'll see later." After she had washed her face and composed herself, Alara joined them for a late supper. The meal was simple, a hearty beef stew and fresh bread, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She sat at the long wooden table between Caleb, who ate in his customary silence, and Martha, who kept up a gentle stream of chatter about the goings-on at the ranch. "I must explain," Alara said, setting down her spoon. She could not accept their charity without offering the truth. She told them everything about her parents' death from influenza 2 years prior, her lonely position in Philadelphia, and the letters from the non-existent Mr. Sterling. As she spoke, she kept her gaze fixed on her hands, too ashamed to meet their eyes. When she finished, the room was silent. Martha made a soft sound of sympathy. Caleb, however, remained still, his expression unreadable. "I know it was foolish of me to believe him," Alara finished, her voice thick with emotion. "To travel all this way on the word of a man I had never met. But I had so little to keep me there, and his letters, they offered so much hope." Caleb finally spoke, his voice low and even. "It was not foolish. It was hopeful. There is a difference." He pushed his chair back from the table. "I had a family once," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "A wife and a son. Lost them to the fever 5 years back." The confession, so sudden and stark, hung in the air. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw past the hard exterior, past the stoic mask, and glimpsed the vast, barren landscape of his grief. It was a terrain she recognized. Her own loss, the death of her parents, was a fresh, aching wound. But his was a chasm, an older and deeper grief that had fundamentally reshaped the man he was. In that moment, a fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them. They were two strangers, adrift in their own private oceans of loss, who had unexpectedly found a shared shore. "I'm so very sorry," she said softly. He gave a short, sharp nod, acknowledging her words without inviting more. He stood up. "Get some rest, Miss Vance." Like Martha said, Tomorrow is a new day. He turned and left the room, leaving Alara alone with the crackling fire and the profound, echoing silence of his pain. The next morning, Alara awoke to the smell of frying bacon and the sound of a rooster crowing. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and the hard mattress a stark reminder of her predicament. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was stranded, her hopes dashed, entirely dependent on the charity of a grieving recluse and his kind housekeeper. The despair was a physical weight, threatening to press her back into the bed. But Alara Vance was not one to wallow. Her parents had raised her to be resilient. She rose, dressed in her only other serviceable dress, a simple gray cotton, and went to find Martha. She found her in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. "Good morning, dear," Martha said with a warm smile. "Sleep well." "I did, thank you," Alara replied mechanismo. "Mr. Thorne is already gone?" "Hours ago. The ranch doesn't wait for the sun, and neither does he." Martha gestured to the stove. "There's coffee. Help yourself, Martha," Alara began, her resolve firm. "I cannot impose on your kindness. I must find work. Is there a school in Redemption? I am qualified to teach. Or perhaps a position as a seamstress, or a companion." Martha's smile faded slightly. "The schoolteacher we have, Miss Albright, is young and plans to stay. And the families here, well, they're not the sort to hire companions, child. Most folks are just trying to get by." She saw the flicker of panic in Alara's eyes and quickly added, "But that doesn't mean there's nothing. For now, you're our guest. But if you've a mind to make yourself useful, I'd not say no to an extra pair of hands. This house and that man are more than one old woman can manage." And so, Alara's new life began. She insisted on earning her keep, falling into a routine dictated by the sun and the seasons. She helped Martha with the cooking and cleaning, learned to knead bread, mend clothes, and tend the small vegetable garden behind the house. The work was physical and demanding, utterly different from the sedentary life she had known. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and calloused. But with the physical exertion came a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. Caleb remained a distant, watchful presence. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, covered in the dirt and sweat of his labor. He ate his meals with them, but rarely spoke, his silence a wall she could not seem to penetrate. Yet she saw things. She saw the way he gentled his voice when he spoke to his horses, the careful way he repaired a broken chair for Martha, the quiet respect he showed for the land. He was a man of actions, not words, and his actions spoke of a deep, buried decency. He, in turn, observed her. He had expected her to be a fragile, complaining burden. He had expected her to last a day, maybe two, before her refined sensibilities were offended by the hard realities of ranch life. He was wrong. He saw her hauling buckets of water from the well, her jaw set in determination. He saw her patiently stitching a tear in his work shirt, her stitches small and neat. He saw her laughing with Martha in the kitchen, a sound as bright and unexpected as a wildflower blooming in a rock crevice. She was not a delicate thing. She had a spine of steel beneath her soft-spoken exterior. A grudging respect began to take root in him. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of haying, he came into the kitchen to find her alone, humming softly to herself as she polished the silverware. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. The lamplight caught the honey-gold strands in her hair, and for a moment she looked ethereal, a creature police a different world. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "I know. I want to. It's peaceful." She held up a fork, admiring its shine. "It reminds me of home, of my mother. We used to do this together. It was an opening, an invitation." He could have walked away. He should have walked away. Instead, he found himself leaning against the doorframe. "You miss it?" "The East." Alara paused, considering his question. "I miss my parents," she said softly. "I miss the libraries and the music. But the life I had there, it was small, confined. Here," she gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the vast, dark expanse of the night. Everything is so big. It's frightening, but it's also freeing. It feels more real. Somehow her answer surprised him. He had assumed she would be desperate to return to her world of comfort and civilization. This life is hard, he warned. It takes more than it gives, most times perhaps, she conceded. But at least it is a life of your own making. You built this, Mr. Thorne. This house, this ranch. You made it from nothing. There is honor in that. Her words, spoken with such simple, earnest sincerity, struck a chord deep inside him. No one had spoken to him of honor in years. They spoke of land, of cattle, of profit and loss. She saw something more. She saw the man he had tried to be, the man he once was before grief had scoured him clean. He felt a crack appear in the ice around his heart. Epsilon Taupi Odoro Epsilon Alpha, and frightening. Caleb, he said abruptly. She looked at him, confused. I beg your pardon? My name. It's Caleb. It was a small offering, but it felt momentous. A lowering of the drawbridge, if only by an inch. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, transforming it. Caleb, she repeated softly. It's a strong name. She returned to her polishing, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The wall between them was still there, but for the first time, it seemed possible to scale. The fragile peace Bolthik, their strange, new domesticity, was not destined to last. 2 weeks after Alara's arrival, 2 strangers rode into redemption. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They were dressed in dark, city-made suits that fit them poorly, and they wore their guns with a sigh of casual menace that set them apart. They stabled their horses and went straight to the saloon, where they began asking questions. Questions about a woman from the East who had arrived on the train. Sheriff Brody, a man whose placid demeanor belied a sharp and observant mind, took note. He was a friend of Caleb's, one of the few people who knew the full story of his past tragedy. He rode out to the Whispering Creek Ranch that afternoon, his face grim. He found Caleb repairing a section of corral fence. Caleb, the sheriff said, dismounting. We've got company in town. He described the 2 men, their clothes, their weapons, and their questions. They're asking about your Miss Vance. Caleb's hand stilled, his knuckles white where he gripped the hammer. He had known, on some level, that Alara's story was not as simple as a cruel prank. The ticket, the elaborate letters, it had all been too calculated. Who do you figure they are? My guess? Pinkertons, or men a similar line off work, Brody said. Hired muscle. I think your house guest didn't just leave her old life behind, Caleb. I think she might have run from it. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Or more likely, from someone in it Caleb's mind raced. He thought of the man who had supposedly written the letters, Jacob Sterling. A fabrication. But why? To lure her out here, away from everything and everyone she knew. To isolate her. A cold dread settled in his gut. This was Silas Croft's handiwork. It had to be. Croft had been trying to get his ranch for a year, using threats and lowball offers. When that failed, he must have resorted to a more insidious tactic. Create a distraction, a vulnerability. A woman. It's Croft, Caleb said, his voice hard. He's behind this, Sheriff Brody nodded slowly. That's what I was thinking. The man's got no bottom to his greed. He wants her water, and he'll stop at nothing to get it. Using an innocent woman as a pawn in his game. It's low. Even for him, the sheriff looked Caleb Epsilon Taupi Odoro Epsilon Alpha in the eye. You need to be careful. These men aren't local thugs. They're professionals. That evening, the tension in the ranch house was palpable. Caleb was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the coiled, watchful silence of a predator. Alara sensed the change in him, the new layer of hardness in his eyes. She saw him cleaning his rifle and his sidearm after supper, his movements economical and deadly. Is something wrong, Caleb? She asked, her voice hushed. He looked at her, his expression grim. He wanted to shield her from it, to keep her in the bubble of ignorance she had occupied for the past 2 weeks. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the bubble was about to burst. There are men in town, he said, his voice low. They're looking for you. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Who? What? I don't know for sure, he lied, unwilling to voice his suspicions about Croft and frighten her further. But they're not friends. You're to stay close to the house. Do not go riding alone. Do you understand me, Alara?" He had used her name, and the gravity in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The feeling of being freed, of being in a place of safety, evaporated like a mirage. The world outside the sturdy walls of this house was still full of danger, and it had found her. The next day, the threat escalated from theoretical to terrifyingly real. Believing she would be safest occupied with a simple task, Caleb had allowed Alara to ride one of his steadiest mares, Daisy, in the large pasture near the house. He was working not 100 yards away, mending a fence, keeping a constant, surreptitious watch over her. She was beginning to feel more confident on horseback, the rhythmic motion of the horse calming her frayed nerves. The sun was warm on her back, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that Caleb was being overcautious. Then it happened. 2 riders appeared at the far end of the pasture, silhouetted against the bright sky. Caleb saw them instantly. It was the men from town. One of them spurred his horse, riding hard along the fence line, deliberately flushing a covey of quail from the tall grass. The birds exploded into the air with a deafening whir of wings, directly in front of Alara's horse. Daisy, for all her steadiness, was a living animal. She shied violently, her eyes wide with terror, and then she bolted. Alara, caught by surprise, lost a stirrup and cried out as she fought to stay in the saddle, her hands tangled in the reins. The horse, now panicked, galloped blindly across the uneven ground, heading Epsilon Tau Phi Odoro Epsilon Alpha, a stretch of rocky, broken terrain. Caleb did not hesitate. He dropped his tools and sprinted toward his own horse, tethered nearby. He vaulted into the saddle, his heart pounding with a cold, primal fear he had not felt in 5 years. He dug his heels into the buckskin's flanks, and the horse leaped forward, eating up the ground in a powerful gallop. He could see Alara clinging desperately to the runaway horse's neck. He saw the terror on her face. The image of Sarah, pale and still in her bed, flashed before his eyes, superimposed over the vision of Alara being thrown against the rocks. A raw, protective fury surged through him. "Easy, girl. Easy," he yelled, his voice a low, commanding roar. He pushed his horse harder, closing the distance. The 2 riders, their cruel work done, had reined in their horses and were watching, their faces smug. Caleb ignored them. All that mattered was the woman on the bolting horse. He drew level with the panicked mare, reaching out. "Alara, give me the reins." She was crying, her face white with fear, but she heard him. She fumbled with the leather straps, her grip slipping. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. "Let go of the pommel. Reach for me." He urged his horse closer, so close their knees nearly touched. He leaned far out of his saddle, his arm outstretched. It was a dangerous, reckless maneuver. If he lost his balance, they would both go down. He didn't care. Trusting the command in his voice, Alara released her death grip on the saddle and reached for him. Her fingers brushed his, then locked around his forearm. With a surge of strength, he pulled, hauling her bodily from her saddle and into his. She landed half in his lap, half against his chest, her arms flying around his neck. He wrapped one arm around her, holding her tight against him, while his other hand expertly gathered the reins of both his horse and the now slowing mare. He brought them to a stop, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the residual adrenaline. Alara was sobbing into his shoulder, her body shaking uncontrollably. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his own. He held her, his hand stroking her back in a clumsy, unpracticed attempt at comfort. The scent of lavender and fear filled his senses. For a long, silent moment, he just held her, the reality of what had almost happened washing over him in sickening waves. He had almost lost her. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the wind from him, cracking his carefully constructed walls of indifference. He had saved her, but in that moment, pressed close against him, her life literally in his hands, he realized with a terrifying clarity that she had also, somehow, saved him. She had made him feel again. And right now, what he felt was a rage so pure and cold it was almost sublime, and a fear so profound it threatened to unmake him. The ride back to the ranch house was a blur of contained fury and dawning horror for Caleb. He held Alara securely in front of him, her head resting against his chest. Her earlier sobs subsided into a series of ragged, catching breaths. He could feel the fine tremor that still ran through her body. Each shudder was a fresh indictment of his own failure. He had brought her here. He had allowed her to be put in harm's way. The two riders, Croft's hired guns, had watched the entire spectacle before turning and trotting away, their message delivered. She was a liability, a target, and his reaction to her near death had exposed a weakness in him he could not afford. He set her down gently on the porch, his hands lingering on her arms for a moment longer than necessary. Martha rushed out, her face a mask of alarm. "What happened?" "I heard the horse. She's fine," Caleb bit out, his voice a low growl. He looked at Alara, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. The sight of her vulnerability was like a knife twisting in his gut. "Take her inside, Martha. Make her some tea." He turned away before either of them could say another word, striding toward the barn. He needed space. He needed to put distance between himself and the overwhelming, terrifying emotions she stirred in him. He had spent 5 years cultivating an emptiness, a safe, sterile void where nothing could touch him. In a matter of weeks, this woman from Philadelphia had filled that void with a terrifying cacophony of feeling. Protectiveness, anger, respect, and something else, something deeper and more dangerous that he refused to name. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a fury of physical labor, splitting firewood with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Each swing of the axe was a blow against his own weakness, against Silas Croft, against a fate that seemed determined to drag him back into the world of feeling and loss. He had built his fortress to keep the pain out, but he had not accounted for the enemy tunneling in from within. That evening, he waited until Martha had retired for the night. Alara was sitting by the fire, a blanket padros around her shoulders, staring into the flames. She had barely spoken a word since the incident. Caleb stood in the center of the room, his stance rigid. He had rehearsed what he had to say, honing the words into sharp, necessary weapons. "You have to leave," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. Alara's head snapped up, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" "I'm taking you to Cheyenne in the morning," he continued, his gaze fixed on a point just over her head. "There's a daily train from there. It could take you back east. Back where you belong." The color drained from her face, replaced by a flush of hurt and anger. "Where I belong. And where is that, Caleb?" "Back to a life as a paid companion, with no family and no future." "You're sending me away." "I am sending you to safety," he corrected, his voice hard. "Those men today, they were not a coincidence. This place is not safe for you. As long as you are here, you are in danger." His words were meant to be a logical explanation, but she heard only the cold, hard finality of his decision. She heard rejection. After he had held her, after she had felt, for one brief, terrifying moment, a connection to him that was more real than anything she had ever known, he was casting her out. The hurt was a physical ache in her chest. She stood up, letting the blanket fall to the floor. Her spine was straight, her chin high. The frightened girl from the pasture was gone, replaced by a woman a core of tempered steel. "So you have decided my fate for me. You rescue me, and then you discard me when I become an inconvenience." "You are not an inconvenience," he ground out, his control slipping. "You are a target, and I will not have your blood on my hands. My blood," she cried, her voice rising. "Is that all I am to you? A liability? A potential stain on your conscience? I thought after today, I thought you saw me as a person." "I do," he said, and the admission was torn from him. "That is precisely the problem. A person can be hurt. A person can be killed." He finally met her gaze, and his eyes were full of a torment she could not understand. "I will not watch that happen again. I cannot." The words hung between them, heavy with the ghosts of his past. He was not rejecting her. He was trying to protect himself. He was pushing her away not because he felt nothing, but because he was terrified of what he was beginning to feel. The realization dawned on her, but it did little to soothe the sting of his words. "You are a coward, Caleb Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling whisper. "You are so afraid of feeling anything that you would rather live in an empty shell of a house, in an empty shell of a life. You talk of safety, but you are a prisoner of your own fear." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were true. He knew they were true, and that only made them hurt more. "I'm not a porcelain doll to be packed away when the world becomes unpleasant," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have faced loss. I have faced ruin. I'm still standing. And I will not be sent away like a child who is in the way. You have no choice," he said, his voice turning to ice as he retreated behind his walls. "The decision is made. Be ready at sunrise." He turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoing in the sudden silence. Alara stood alone in the firelight, tears of anger and heartbreak streaming down her face. He was trying to save her, but in doing so, he was destroying the first glimmer of home she had felt since her parents died. She would not let him. She would not be so easily dismissed. If she was to leave this place, it would be on her own terms, not as a piece of fragile cargo he was shipping back to where it came from. Alara did not sleep. She spent the night alternating between a cold fury and a profound, aching sorrow. Caleb's decree, delivered with such brutal finality, had wounded her more deeply than she would have thought possible. He saw her as a weakness, a chink in his armor. He was so terrified of a phantom pain from his past that he was willing to inflict a very real one on her in the present. As the first pale light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, her resolve hardened. She would not be taken to Cheyenne like a parcel. She would not allow him to dictate the terms of her departure. She dressed quickly, packing her few belongings back into her trunk. She wrote a short, stiff note from Martha, thanking her for her kindness and apologizing for the abrupt departure. For Caleb, she left nothing. Her silence would be her final word. She crept out of the quiet house and made her way to the small corral where Daisy, the mare from yesterday, was kept. The horse nickered softly as she approached. Alara's knowledge of saddling a horse was rudimentary at best, gleaned from watching Caleb, but desperation was a powerful teacher. After several clumsy attempts, she managed to secure the saddle and bridle. She did not know where she would go. To redemption first. Then she would take the stagecoach, any stagecoach, heading anywhere. Anywhere but here. Meanwhile, Silas Croft was also awake. He sat in the opulent, overstuffed office of his town house, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The report from his men had been unsatisfactory. Thorne was resilient, and the woman, instead of being a distraction, seemed to have stirred some protective instinct in him. Croft was a man of limited patience. He had wanted Thorne's land for its water, and his attempts at legal and financial pressure had failed. The scheme with the woman had backfired. It was time for a more direct approach. "He's sentimental about that patch of dirt," Croft said to the two hired guns, who stood before his desk. "And now he's sentimental about the girl. So we'll take them both from him. Burn the house, the barn, run off his stock. When he has nothing left to protect, he'll sell for pennies on the dollar." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "Go tonight. Make sure to clean sweep. I want Thorne neutralized, and the girl, she's a loose end. Tidy it up." The two men nodded, their faces impassive. They were being paid for a job, and the morality of it was of no concern to them. Caleb rose before the sun, his body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The confrontation with Alara had left him feeling raw and exposed. Every word she had spoken had been a barb of truth, lodging itself deep in his soul. He was a coward. He was a prisoner. But he was a prisoner who knew the face of his jailer. His jailer was grief, and it was a warden that never slept. He went to the kitchen, expecting to find her waiting, her face sullen and resentful. The room was empty. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the one he'd felt yesterday, seized him. He strode to her room. The door was ajar. The bed was neatly made. Her trunk was gone. On the nightstand was a note addressed to Martha. He snatched it and read it, his eyes scanning the neat, cursive script. She was gone. The foolish, stubborn, courageous woman had run. A string of curses, low and vicious, escaped his lips. He ran outside. The early morning light revealed what he already knew in his gut. The gate to the small corral was open, and Daisy was gone. She would head for town, he knew. She was on her own, in a land she did not understand, with dangerous men hunting her. He didn't even stop to saddle his horse. He just ran. He ran toward the barn, his long legs eating up the ground, his mind a maelstrom of fear and self-recrimination. This was his fault. His coldness, his fear, had driven her out into the very danger he was trying to save her from. It was then that he heard it, the telltale sound of shod hooves on the dirt road leading to the ranch. It wasn't Alara. It was too many horses moving too fast. He skidded to a halt, his every sense on high alert. He peered around the corner of the barn. 3 riders were approaching, their forms dark against the rising sun. Croft and his 2 thugs. They were not coming for a parley. There was no time to think. He scrambled back into the barn, his mind racing. Alara was gone, out in the open, but Martha was still in the house. He had to protect his home. He had to protect his family, what was left of it. He grabbed the rifle he always kept propped by the barn door. From the house, Martha, awakened by the sound of the approaching horses, looked out the window. She saw the 3 men, and she saw the hard, determined set of their jaws. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She ran to the back door, her mind on only one thing: escape. As the riders fanned out, dismounting and drawing their weapons, a 4th rider appeared, coming from the direction of the creek. It was Alara. She had circled back, her flight of peak warring with a deeper, more sensible knowledge that she was safer at the ranch, even with a difficult man, than she was alone. She had been about to ride up to the house and swallow her pride when she saw them. 3 men, guns drawn, advancing on the house. Her heart leaped in her throat. She reined Daisy in behind a thick stand of cottonwoods, her mind reeling. This was it. This was the danger Caleb had warned her about. He was in the barn. Martha was in the house. And she was out here, watching it unfold, helpless. The first shot rang out, shattering the morning's peace. It came from a barn. Caleb had fired a warning shot over their heads. "Get off my land," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the yard. Croft laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "This land is as good as mine, Thorne. You can die with it, or you can walk away." Another shot, this one splintering the wood of the barn door inches from Caleb's head. The fight was on. Caleb was a good shot, and he was on his home ground, but he was outnumbered. He hunkered down behind a stack of hay bales, the rifle hot in his hands, firing methodically, making each shot count. Alara watched in horror, her hands trembling. She could not just sit here. She had to do something. She was not a doll. She was not a liability. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on a ranch house. One of Croft's men was sneaking toward the back of the house, a torch in his hand. He was going to set on fire. With Martha inside, a primal, protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, surged through Alara. She slid off Daisy's back, her mind clear and cold. She was not a fighter. She had never handled a weapon in her life. But she would not stand by and watch them burn everything to the ground. She crept through the tall grass, palavras the back of the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man was fumbling with a match, trying to light the torch against the wind. He was focused, his back to her. The kitchen window was just above his head. Alara slipped inside the back door, which Martha had left unlatched in her panic. The kitchen was empty. Martha had fled to the root cellar, as Caleb had instructed her to do in case of trouble. Alara's eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the massive, cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. It was heavy, formidable. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, its weight solid and reassuring in her hands. She heard a crash of glass. The man, having failed with the torch, had smashed the kitchen window with the butt of his pistol. A gloved hand reached inside, fumbling for the lock. Alara didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. All her fear, all her anger, all her frustration coalesced into a single, decisive action. She stood beside the window, the skillet held high. The moment the man's head and shoulders cleared the window frame, she swung. She put every ounce of her strength, every bit of her desperation, into the blow. The skillet connected with the side of his head with a sickening, metallic thud. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a sack of grain, half in and half out of the window, unconscious. The noise of the breaking window and the subsequent thud had created a diversion. Croft and the other gunman, distracted, glanced toward the house. It was the opening Caleb needed. He burst from a barn, firing his rifle from the hip. He hit the second gunman in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground, howling in pain. Croft, seeing the tables turn, panicked. He fired wildly in Caleb's direction and ran for his horse. Caleb didn't give him the chance. He chambered another round, took aim, and fired. The bullet struck Croft in the leg. The man screamed and fell, his grab for power ending in a cloud of Wyoming dust. The sudden, shocking silence was deafening. Caleb stood in the middle of the yard, the rifle smoking in his hands, his chest heaving. His first thought was of Alara. He had seen her ride off. She was supposed to be safe. His second thought was of the noise from the house. He sprinted toward the kitchen, his heart in his throat. He burst through the back door and stopped dead. He saw the broken window. He saw the unconscious thug, bleeding from a gash on his temple. And he saw Alara, standing in the middle of the room, the heavy iron skillet still clutched in her white-knuckled hands, her body trembling. She looked at him, her blue eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrible realization of what she had done. The skillet slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. Caleb didn't say a word. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent. She was here. She was safe. He had almost lost her, first to his own foolish pride, and then to Croft's bullets. The thought shattered the last of his carefully constructed defenses. The ice around his heart did not just crack, it disintegrated. "I thought you were gone," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he let her see everything. The fear, the relief, the love. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raw. "So wrong. Solitude isn't safety. It's just empty. I've been living in a tomb of my own making, Alara. You brought the light back in." He took a shuddering breath. "Don't leave. Please, don't ever leave. Stay. Stay with me." Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. He wasn't pushing her away. He was pulling her closer. He wasn't a coward. He was a man who had been so deeply wounded he had forgotten how to live. And somehow, impossibly, she had reminded him. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, over his rapidly beating heart. "I'm home." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future reclaimed from the brink of despair. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost in the wilderness of his own grief and had finally found his way home. The aftermath of the shootout was a flurry of grim activity. Sheriff Brody and a hastily assembled posse arrived, having been alerted by the sound of gunfire echoing through the valley. They took a wounded and cursing Silas Croft and his 2 thugs into custody. Croft's reign of greed was over. Martha, shaken but unharmed, emerged from the root cellar, her relief palpable when she saw that Caleb and Alara were safe. Amidst the official business and the cleanup, Caleb and Alara moved in a world of their own. A quiet, unspoken understanding now flowed between them, as tangible as the air they breathed. The barriers were down, the pretenses stripped away by the violence of the morning. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had found the beginnings of a new life. The next day, a fragile peace settled over the Whispering Creek Ranch. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the land, which had so recently been a battlefield, seemed calm and serene. The broken window in the kitchen was temporarily boarded up, a stark reminder of the chaos. Alara found Caleb in his forge, a small, open-sided structure near the barn. He was not working the bellows, but standing before the cold anvil, his back to her. He was holding something in his hands, staring down at it intently. She approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the dusty ground. "Caleb," she said softly. He turned, and she saw what he was holding. It was a small, twisted piece of metal, a bullet he had dug out of the barn wall. He closed his hand around it, his expression somber. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice low. "Twice. Once because of my pride, and once because of his greed." He looked at her, his eyes dark with the memory. "I won't risk it a third time," her heart faltered. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to send her away again, that his fear had returned. But then she saw the look in his eyes, and it was not fear. It was a deep, unwavering certainty. He dropped the bullet onto a workbench and took a step toward her. The forge, even cold, smelled of soot and iron and hard work. The setting sun, filtering through the open sides, cast long, dramatic shadows, bathing them in a warm, orange glow. "Alara Vance," he began, his voice formal, yet filled with a raw emotion that made her breath catch. "You came to this land seeking a home and a partner. The man who promised you those things was a lie. But the promise itself, the promise was real. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, simple ring. It was a plain band of yellowed gold, worn smooth with time. It was not fancy, but it shone with the soft, warm light of 1,000 sunsets. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice husky. "She wore it for 50 years on a ranch, not so different from this one. It's a symbol of endurance, of a love that is stronger than hardship." He took her left hand, his calloused thumb stroking her palm. "I have nothing else palavers my past to offer you. Only a future I hope we can build together. I am a quiet man, and I am not skilled with words. But I know this. My life was gray before you came. You brought the color back." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, blurring the image of his strong, earnest face. The tears were of joy, pure and undiluted. This stoic, solitary man, who had walled himself off from the world, was offering her his whole heart. "Marry me, Alara," he whispered, his gaze locked on hers. "Be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my days proving to you that you are not a liability, but my greatest strength. Let me make this your home. For good." She could not speak. She could only nod, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. He took her nod as the answer it was, and slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to the ring, sealing his promise. He then drew her into his arms, holding her close as the last rays of the sun painted the horizon in soft purples and burnt oranges. News of Silas Croft's arrest and Caleb Thorne's impending marriage spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. The initial gossip and speculation about the mysterious woman at the Whispering Creek Ranch transformed overnight into a story of heroism and romance. The townsfolk, who had always regarded Caleb with a sort of respectful distance, now saw him in a new light. His actions, and Alara's, had rid them of the menace who had been bullying the entire valley. An outpouring of support followed. Men from neighboring ranches rode out to help Caleb repair the damage from the shootout, refusing any payment. The women of the town, led by the sheriff's wife, descended on the ranch house, bearing pies, quilts, and practical advice for the bride-to-be. They helped Alara and Martha replace the broken window and gave Alara a bolt of fine blue fabric, insisting she have a proper wedding dress. Alara, who had arrived in this town a lonely and deceived stranger, found herself enveloped by a community faitors she had never known. These were not the polite, detached social circles of Philadelphia. This was a raw, genuine, and deeply loyal community, forged by shared hardship and mutual reliance. They were welcoming her into their fold, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Their wedding, held 2 weeks later, was a simple affair. The ceremony took place under the giant cottonwood trees by the creek, the same creek Silas Croft had been willing to kill for. The preacher from Redemption officiated, his voice mingling with the gentle sound of the water and the rustling leaves. Alara wore a dress made from the blue fabric the townswomen had given her, her hair adorned with a spray of wildflowers Caleb had picked for her that morning. Caleb stood beside her, his customary worn denim replaced by a new, dark suit that made him look impossibly tall and handsome. He rarely smiled, but as he looked at Alara, a soft, private smile touched his lips, a smile that was for her and her alone. The entire town of Redemption seemed to be in attendance. They stood in a wide, happy circle, their faces turned toward the couple, their presence a testament to the couple's acceptance and integration into the heart of the community. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a great cheer went up. Caleb, in a move of uncharacteristic public affection, swept Alara into his arms and kissed her deeply, to the delight of the crowd. They were no longer two solitary individuals, but a unit, a family, the new heart of the Whispering Creek Ranch. 2 years later, the high summer sun beat down on the Whispering Creek Ranch, but it was a benevolent warmth, not a scorching heat. The land was green and lush, the creek full and babbling. The ranch itself had prospered under Caleb's steady hand and Alara's quiet, organizing influence. A new wing had been added to the house, its fresh-cut pine a pale gold against the weathered, graying timber of the original structure. The garden was overflowing with vegetables and flowers, a riot of color and life that had been Alara's domain. Alara sat on the shaded porch, a rocking chair creaking rhythmically beneath her. In her arms, a small boy with a shock of dark, unruly hair and his mother's bright blue eyes slept peacefully, his small hand clutching a fold of her dress. This was Benjamin Thorne, named for the brother he would never know, a bridge between a painful past and a hopeful future. Alara herself was heavy with her second child, her form rounded and serene. She looked out over the valley, the raw, intimidating landscape that had once seemed so hostile now felt like a part of her. She knew its moods, its scents, its seasons. The initial terror and uncertainty she had felt upon her arrival seemed like a memory from another woman's life. She had not just adapted to this place. She had bloomed in it. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. She heard the familiar, heavy tread of his boots on the porch steps. Caleb appeared, his work for the day done. He had shed the hard, guarded mask he once wore. The lines on his face were still there, etched by sun and sorrow, but they were softened now by contentment. His eyes, once so full of shadows, were clear and full of a quiet, steady love whenever he looked at her. He crossed the porch and knelt before her chair, his large, calloused hand gently stroking their son's downy hair. "He's sleeping," Caleb whispered, his voice a low, soft rumble. "He wore himself out chasing butterflies," Alara murmured, her heart swelling with a love so powerful it was almost a physical presence. Caleb leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then another to her lips. He remained kneeling before her, his hands coming to rest on her rounded belly, where he felt the faint flutter of the new life within. He looked from his sleeping son to his beautiful, glowing wife, to the house they had built and the land that sustained them. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were no longer menacing specters. They were quiet, gentle memories, integrated into the rich tapestry of his new life. He looked into Alara's eyes, his own reflecting the vast, peaceful sky behind her. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the years of self-imposed exile had been a long, hard road. But it had led him here. It had led him to her. "Everything I ever needed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a summary of all the words he could never quite find. "It was always right here,